All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. Before we get into the book today, got a couple things to quickly go over. Looks like we got our first big booty Latina mass shooter in Rhode Island, which I guess this just happened today. No, that's not it. That's some other stuff. Apparently, Roberta Esposito from Pawtucket, Rhode Island, did a mass shooting at their child's hockey game, killing their own family members, the wife or the mother of the child, and another child. All members of his family, or her family, sorry, Miss Esposito. Don't want to mess that up. You can see some of the pictures from the traumatic event here. Now, a good Samaritan did jump in and try to subdue the assailant, but the person had another firearm which they used to commit suicide after killing several members of their family. So maybe we should be more cautious about mass deportation since the big booty Latinas are just going nuts. Definitely a big booty Latina here from Pawtucket, Rhode Island. Definitely a big booty Latina, for sure. That's what I see. That's what you guys see too, right? Big booty Latina riding a Harley Davidson with tattoos. Look at that booty. So yeah, we got our first big booty Latina mass shooter. That's some news. Definitely don't need to ban this or stop people from doing that. They're all sane. They're all definitely sane. Okay. Now, I wanted to talk about why I'm still a libertarian at heart. Because looking at the old intergalactic Jewish satanic pedophile case, otherwise known as the Epstein files. Now, if you add up all the money of all the FBI agents that worked on the Epstein case over the years, you'd have to at least guess that it's in the millions or hundreds of millions of dollars that all these FBI agents are getting paid, right? But yet, probably any 10-year-old on the internet could teach you how to compress all the files into a zip folder so people can just download the zip folder with all the information. So you could put an MP3 in there, you could put a picture in there, a JPEG, MP4, text files, all types of other document type files, Word files, doc files, and note card files. You could put them all in a zip folder, and then people could just download the zip folder instead of having to go to like broken links, downloading each file individually one by one out of 3 million files. Like, these people should be fired. These people should all be fired. Whoever was responsible for uploading the files like that, one by one, with broken links. Can you imagine if you showed up at work as a regular civilian and your boss was like, oh, I need that report. And then you sent him a report with broken links, missing files, and sent all the files one by one. It's like a 1,000-page report, and you send him the files one by one, each one in an individual email. You would be fired immediately. You would be fired immediately from your job. Immediately. He'd be like, what? There's broken links here. Where's the picture for this? Where's the text file for this? Why did you send me one file, each file individually? You'd be fired, but they get to keep their job. And like in the aggregate, they're getting paid millions of dollars, and they're supposed to be some of the smartest and most professional people in the country. Ridiculous. Utterly ridiculous. Just think about it. If you did something like that, your boss was like, I need those files, I need that report, and you send him a report in the same condition that they uploaded the files to the Epstein files thing, immediately fired. Immediately. They'd be like, you just gotta walk out now. Don't even clean out your desk. None of that. Just leave the building. We're escorting you out of the building right now. Right? Okay. So the last thing I want to get to is trying to explain why Catholics got rid of arranged marriages. Now, I did some research into arranged marriages. I've read a bunch of reports. Basically, most of them were either like, what do you call, like anthropological reports of like past civilizations, like Native Americans and Aboriginal people everywhere and stuff. And the more modern reports, the only places left are like Pakistan and India that have arranged marriages. Now, I didn't really talk about it because this is Shaw was doing similar research and he kind of beat me to the punch there. So I was just let him run with it or whatever. But in explaining why Catholics, eliminated arranged marriage, it makes sense because the Roman Catholic Empire was like a middle class society where the middle class was like upwardly mobile because of like the Enlightenment and all. Well, it was kind of before the Enlightenment, but just due to, the Roman like advancements in civilization, people were pretty upwardly mobile. They had a upwardly mobile merchant class. And so it makes sense because the like quote unquote love marriages, that's what they call it, but really it's a hypergamous marriage, make more sense to middle class people that are upwardly mobile, because then it's freeing up the daughters to move up in status as high as possible in society. And it's also driving the men to be more upwardly mobile. So it makes sense. But the problem is that arranged marriages are better for poor people, right? So like in a poor society or people that are more poor, arranged marriage is actually better for them because it unites the families together and allows them to absorb all types of different crises and economic shocks and health shocks and stuff like that. When you have a large extended family, it's better for poor people, right? And it's also harder for poor people to get married in a hypergamous system, right? So you can see why there's kind of like a tension between arranged marriage and quote unquote love marriage, which is really just hypergamous marriage, because our society still kind of has middle class values. So we promote the hypergamous marriage, but it's at the detriment of the lower classes, because the lower classes, it's actually better for, arranged marriage. And even to the point where you can see in the studies where in certain places where they can either do a hypergamous marriage or an arranged marriage, that they'll pick the like best child or sibling and push them towards hypergamous marriage, and then the other siblings, they'll push them towards arranged marriages. So they kind of get the best of both worlds, where they have one child that's upwardly mobile and they'll invest all their resources into sending them to college and all that other stuff so that they can be upwardly mobile. And then the other siblings, they'll basically put them into arranged marriages to strengthen family bonds in the community. So there's pros and cons to both. Like, you can definitely see how the hypergamous marriage definitely breaks down community bonds because it puts men into a hyper competitive mode. And then it also leads to like, wife stealing, cuckolding, all this type of stuff, right? Where the arranged marriage, while the woman might not be as happy in it, it definitely strengthens community bonds, unites families together. And like I said, helps the families withstand all types of different crises and shocks. So that's that. That's my take on arranged marriage versus hypergamous marriage. There you have it. All right. Okay, so we're still on the future in perspective. This is the last chapter. European ambiguities on page 1279. The problems facing Europe cannot be presented in a simple outline such as we have offered for those of the United States. Europe is too diverse on a national or even regional basis. Its long history has left too many influential survivals as exceptions to any simple analysis, and its class lines are more complicated and much more rigid than in America. Nonetheless, it is probably true to say that America has passed Europe in the evolution of our Western civilization, and that Europeans in general are concerned with problems, notably the problems of material acquisition, which were dominant in the United States almost a generation ago. However, because of the diversity of Europe, any statements we make about the situation would almost certainly have more exceptions than confirming examples in Europe as a whole. The general picture we might draw is of a continent deprived for at least one full generation, 1914 to 1950, of political, economic, social, and psychological security. In consequence, that area came to regard these things as major aims in its personal behavior patterns. So many European families were deprived, or even the necessary, oh, deprived of even the necessary materials of a living that they are today, to varying degrees, obsessed with the desire for these, now that it seems possible to get them. For this reason, the chief impression the visiting American brings back from Europe is one of grasping materialism and exaggerated individualism. This is a spirit akin to America in the 1920s rather than that of the 1950s. It is found with the variety of emphasis among the peasants, the workers, and even the aristocracy, as well as among the bourgeois and petty bourgeois, where we expect it. It is combined with an antagonism between classes and groups that is rare in America except among the petty bourgeois. The middle class adolescent revolt is rarer and much harsher in Europe, shot through with elements of hatred, where in America it is shot through with elements of indiscriminate loving. And in Europe, the selfishness and general bitchiness of middle class girls is much greater than in the United States, probably because the stronger male dominant tradition in Europe leaves them less freedom, less self esteem, and lower personal evaluation. As an example of the diversity of Europe, we should say that this last remark is more true of Southern Europe than of Northern Europe, and largely untrue of England. In fact, most generalizations about Europe do not apply to England at all. In the European search for security, the two dominant aims have been security against the Soviet attack and nuclear war, and security against economic collapse such as occurred in the 1930s and opened the way to Nazism and World War II. The disorganization of Europe in the immediate post-war period allowed the United States to play a dominant role in both of these aims. However, by the latter 1950s, as fear of war and depression subsided, it became possible for Europe to adopt a more independent attitude. At the same time, the personal influence of President de Gaulle gave this new independence anti-American overtones which, however justified by the general's personal experience with incompetent American foreign policies, nonetheless were injurious to the solidarity and prosperity of Europe. As long as American influence was dominant, the security of Europe was based primarily on America's strategic nuclear power, supplemented in an ambiguous way by the 15-nation NATO treaty, which included both the United States and Canada. On the economic side, European prosperity was based for many years on American economic aid. Both of these influences were exercised to develop as an ultimate goal an integrated Western Europe that would include Britain and be closely allied to North America. As we have already seen, these efforts gradually bogged down in a complicated morass of partly integrated systems on a functional rather than a federative basis, and by 1965 were stalemated over a number of unresolved inconsistencies of approach. These problems will be analyzed in a moment, but before we do so, we should point out that a new Europe is clearly being formed on lines that have little in common with the Europe of pre war days. That earlier Europe was based on the social and ideological patterns of the past and continued to reflect them, even when the real forces of military and economic technology were creating quite different relationships. Moreover, these older patterns were quite rigid and doctrinaire. In most of Europe, they showed sharp, almost irreconcilable divisions into three political groupings that we might designate as conservative, liberal, and socialist. These represented, in order, the social forces of the 18th century and the mid 19th century and of the early 20th century. The conservatives stood for an alliance of all the forces of the period before the French Revolution of 1789, the agrarian and landed interest, the old nobility and monarchy, the clerical interest, and the old army. The liberals stood for the bourgeois interest of the commercial, financial, and industrial revolution. They were concerned with maintaining the dominant position of property, were usually rigid supporters of laissez-faire, were opposed to influence based on birth or land, were opposed to extension of state authority, and were usually anti-clerical and anti-militarist. The socialists represented the interests and ideals of the working masses of the cities. They were in favor of democracy and individual political equality and wanted the activities of the state to be extended to regulate economic life for the benefit of ordinary man. The socialists were generally opposed to the same social groups and older interests as the liberals, but added to these enemies the bourgeois also. In general, these three diverse groupings were rigid and put more emphasis on the things that divided them than on matters of common concern. Their hatreds were more dominant than their common interests. These divisions of Europe along lines of selfish interest, old slogans, doctrinaire hatreds, and misconceived rivalries made possible the rise of fascism and the disasters of World War II. Out of these disasters, in the turmoil and violence of the resistance, there began to appear the lineaments of a new Europe. This new Europe was much more pragmatic and thus less doctrinaire. It was much more cooperative and less competitive. It was much more receptive to diversity, partial solutions, and the need for mutual dependence than the period before 1939 had been. On the whole, this new spirit, found among the leaders rather than among the masses, was much closer to what we have defined as the tradition of the West than the Europe of 1900 had been. It must be recognized that this new Europe had its roots in the resistance, and as such, had traces of those elements of self-sacrifice, human solidarity, personal integrity, and flexible improvisation that appeared so unexpectedly among the hardened resistance fighters. We might say that many of the elements of outlook and leadership of the new post-war Europe emerged from underground and were unnoticed by those who had not been in active contact with the underground. Thus, they were not observed by the leaders in Washington and in London, even by de Gaulle, and, above all, were unreported by Allen Dulles, who was supposed to be observing the underground for the OSS from Switzerland. Supporters of this new outlook were determined to break free from the nationalistic hatred of the pre-war period and to emphasize instead Europe as a cultural entity of diverse nationalities. Above all, they were insistent on the urgent need to heal the terrible breach running through the heart of Europe between France and Germany. They were eager to establish some kind of liaison between religion and socialism by way of Christian charity and social welfare in order to repudiate the unnatural 19th century alliance between the clergy and capitalism. They were determined to use the power of the state to settle the common problems of man, unhampered by doctrinaire liberalism and laissez faire. And they recognized the joint role of capital and labor in any productive process, although they had no way of measuring or of dividing the rewards of each from that process. In two words, this new outlook was determined to make Europe more unified and more spiritual. This new outlook was unable to influence the fate of Europe for at least a decade after the ending of World War II in 1945 because of the urgent material need to repair the devastation of the war, the overwhelming threat to Europe from the Soviet Union and from doctrinaire communism, and because of the decadence of Europe, both for reconstruction and defense. Because of the dependence of Europe, both for reconstruction and defense, on the United States and Britain, both of whom ignored the new forces stirring on the continent. By 1955, however, as these urgent problems receded into the background and Europe became increasingly able to stand on its own feet, the new structure began to become visible, indicated by the cooperation of Christian socialists and social democrats in the constructive process and by the continued decline of the forces of the extreme right and the extreme left. It was the new spirit rooted in the resistance and the tacit agreement of the Christian socialist and social democratic political groups that made it possible to work toward European unity and to use this unity as the foundation for rich and independent Europe. The task is still only partly done. It may indeed never be completed, for nothing is more persistent than the old established institutions and outlooks that stand as barriers along the way. The central problem of Europe remains today, as it has for a century, the problem of Germany, and today, as before, this problem cannot be solved without Britain. But such a solution requires that Britain accept the fact that it is, since the invention of the airplane and the rocket, a European and not a world or even an Atlantic power. This, the leaders of Britain and America branch and the American branch of the British establishment have been unwilling to accept. As a consequence, Britain remains aloof from the continent, committed to the Atlantic community and to the Commonwealth of Nations, and accordingly, the political unification of Western Europe stands suspended part way to fulfillment, while the German problem, still capable of triggering the destruction of Western society, remains unsolved. Briefly, the problem is this. No one concerned, the Soviet Union, the United States, or Europe itself, can permit Germany to be unified again in the foreseeable future. A united Germany would be a force of instability and danger to everyone, including the Germans, because it would be the most powerful nation in Europe, and, balanced between East and West, might at any time fall into collaboration with one of these to the intense danger of the other. Or if the Russian-American antithesis remain irreparable, a united Germany could put extreme pressures on the lesser neighbors between the two superpowers. The peace and stability of Europe thus require the permanent division of Germany, something on which the Soviet Union is adamant to the point of restoring to force to retain it. Although the official policy of the United States is still committed to a reunification of Germany, partly in the belief that The loyalty of West Germany to the Atlantic Alliance can be retained only if the United States remains explicitly committed to a future reacquisition of East Germany by West Germany. In fact, the eagerness of the latter to acquire the former is dwindling, although very slowly, since the East is now so poor that it could bring very little but poverty to West Germany's booming prosperity. This separation of the Germanies can be made permanent only if each is incorporated as fully as possible into a larger and distinct political system. But the smaller countries of Europe, particularly the Netherlands and Belgium, do not wish to be united with Germany in any federated system that includes only one other large power, such as France or even France and Italy, since an alignment of West Germany and France in such a federation could dominate the small states completely. Accordingly, the small states want Britain as a democratic counterweight to Germany within any West European federal structure. But de Gaulle, as he made evident in January 1963, will accept Britain into a West European federation only if Britain becomes clearly a European power and renounces its special relationship of close collaboration with the United States, and if it is also willing to subordinate its position as leader of the British Commonwealth of Nations to its membership in the European system. The abandonment of its special relationship with the United States and with the Commonwealth, two major concerns of the English establishment for more than 40 years, was too heavy a price to pay for membership in the European Economic Community, and would have been an unacceptable reversal of established policy in return for something that Britain sought without great enthusiasm. The integration of Western Europe began in 1948 as a consequence of the growth of Soviet aggression that culminated in the Prague coup and the Berlin blockade. The United States had offered Marshall Plan aid with the provision that the European recovery be constructed on a cooperative basis. This led to the Convention for European Economic Cooperation, OEEC, signed in April 1948, and the Hague Congress for European Union, held the following month. The OEEC, which eventually had 18 countries as members and in 1961 was recognized as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, sought to administer American aid to further economic cooperation between sovereign states. The Hague meeting of May 1948, with Winston Churchill and Konrad Adenauer as its chief figures, called for the united Europe and took a very minor step in that direction by establishing a purely advisory, consultative body of 10, later 15 states, the Council of Europe, as a parliamentary assembly at Strasbourg. These steps were clearly inadequate. In 1950, Robert Schuman, then French foreign minister and later prime minister, who had been a German subject during World War I, suggested that a first step be taken towards a federation of Europe by putting the entire coal and steel production of France and Germany under a common high authority. The real attraction of this project was that it would so integrate this basic industry that it would make any war between France and Germany physically impossible. One element in this project was to reconcile the anti-Germans to an economic rehabilitation of Germany, which the continued Soviet aggressions made increasingly necessary. It would also provide a solution to the Franco-German disagreement over the final disposition of the Saar. From this came the European Coal and Steel Community. This was a truly revolutionary organization since it had sovereign powers, including the authority to raise funds outside any existing state's power. This treaty came into force in July 1952, brought the steel and coal industries of 6 countries, France, West Germany, Italy, and Benelux, under a single high authority of 9 members. This supranational body had the right to control prices, channel investment, raise funds, allocate coal and steel during shortages, and fix production in times of surplus. Its power to raise funds for its own use by taxing each ton produced made it independent of governments. Moreover, its decisions were binding and could be reached by majority vote without the unanimity required in most international organizations of sovereign states. The ECSC was a rudimentary government since the high authority was subject to the control of a common assembly elected by the parliaments of the member states, which could force the authority to resign by a 2/3 vote of censure, and it had a court of justice to settle disputes. Most significantly, the ECSC Assembly became a genuine parliament with political party blocs, Christian Democrats, Socialists, and Liberals sitting together independent of national origins. By 1958, the ECSC had abolished internal barriers to trade in oil and steel among the 6. Such trade increased by 157% during the first 5 years and had set up a common tariff against imports of coal and steel into the 6. Production of steel increased 65% during the 5 years, and the process of using ECSC funds to modernize the coal industry and to close down exhausted mines, moving hundreds of thousands of miners out of mining and into other employment, had begun. When the Korean War began in 1950, the United States demanded formation of 12 German divisions to strengthen NATO in Europe. The French, who feared any rebirth of German militarism, drew up an elaborate scheme for a European Defense Community, EDC, that would merge the German recruits into a European army under the joint European control. Like ECSC, the European Defense Community was able to be supranational agency that would eventually take its place, along with the ECSC, within a European government. The general pattern of this super government was established in the EDC project itself, with a bicameral European Parliament and a president to preside over a European Cabinet Council. Unfortunately for these plans, the left and the right in the French Assembly joined together to reject the EDC Treaty, August 1954. The left was opposed to the EDC because any union of Europe would reduce Soviet influence on the continent, while the right, led by the Gaullists, were unwilling to see German armed forces re-established without any guarantee that Britain and the United States would retain forces within Europe to balance the new German forces. Failure of Britain to recognize explicitly its inevitable commitment to European defense early in 1954 allowed EDC to die. A symbolic but ineffectual step was made to calm these French fears in September 1954 when Sir Anthony Eden instigated a Western European Union WEU of 7 states, the 6 plus Britain, as a consultative group to oversee German rearmament. As part of this agreement, the British promised to keep 4 divisions in Europe until the year 2000 if necessary, but within 3 years, 1 of these divisions was pulled out and the other 3 fell substantially below full strength. As a result of this agreement and a number of other factors, including recognition that the rearmament of Germany was inevitable, the French Assembly in December 1954 ratified the Paris Treaties that legalized the changes in Germany's status that France most feared. Western Germany regained its sovereign independence, obtained the right to have a national army, although without nuclear weapons, and became an equal member of NATO. Having thus accepted much of what they did not want, an armed and sovereign Germany, it became clear to many Frenchmen that they must make a strenuous effort to get some of the things they did want, chiefly the merging of Germany into a West European system that would prevent the new German power from being used in a nationalistic aggression. Accordingly, the six met again at Messina in June 1955. There they decided that the next step towards West European integration must be economic rather than political. From this flowed the Treaty of Rome, March 1957, which established a European Economic Community, better known as the Common Market, as well as the European Atomic Community for joint exploitation of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, Euratom. Both agreements went into effect at the beginning of 1958. The EEC Treaty, with 572 articles over almost 400 pages, like the treaties establishing ECSC and Euratom, looked forward to eventual political union in Europe and sought economic integration as an essential step on the way. The project originated with the head of the French Economic Planning Commission, Jean Monnet, whose ideas were pushed along by the energy of Foreign Minister Paul Henry Spaak of Belgium. Within the three large nations, agreement was obtained by the efforts of the leaders of the respective Christian Democratic parties, Adenauer, Schuman, and Alcide de Gasperi. The Catholic religious background of all three was a significant factor in their willingness to turn from nationalistic to international economic methods, while Spaak's socialist prestige helped to reconcile the moderate left to the scheme. The slowing up of the process of economic recovery that had begun with the Marshall Plan in 1949 helped to win widespread acceptance of the new effort for joint economic expansion. Briefly, the Rome Treaty established the methods and time schedule by which the signatory countries, as well as other nations might wish to join, could integrate their economies into a single, more expansive system. Tariffs and other restrictions on trade between them were to be abolished by stages and replaced by a common tariff against the outside world. At the same time, investment was to be directed so as to integrate their joint economy as a whole, with special attention to the industrialization of backward and underdeveloped regions such as southern Italy. Special consideration was given to agriculture, largely detaching it from the market economy to cushion the integrative process while improving the standards of living and social protection from the farming of the farming population. As part of the integrative process, there was to be free movement of persons, services, and capital within the community, with gradual development of community citizenship for workers. This whole process was to be achieved by stages over many years. The agricultural agreement, for example, was implemented by an elaborate agreement that was signed after 140 hours of almost continuous negotiation in January 1962. By the middle of that year, the internal tariffs among members had been reduced in three stages to half of their 1958 levels. The institutional organization for carrying on this process was familiar to that setup for the ECSC and the abortive EDC. The European Parliamentary Assembly for supranational party blocs of Christian Democrats, Socialists, and Liberals sitting and voting together, irrespective of national origins. A council of ministers representing the member governments directly, an executive high commission of 9 that is enjoined by law to exercise their functions in complete independence of their national governments, a court of justice with powers to interpret the treaty and settle disputes, 2 advisory groups, the Monetary Committee and the Social and Economic Committee, a European Investment Bank to channel funds for integrative and development purposes within the community, the Overseas Development Fund to do the same for former colonial territories now associated indirectly with the ECC, a European Social Fund for industrial retraining and unemployment compensation, and finally the 2 associated communities, ECSC and Euratom. These last 2 were integrated with the ECC from the fact that the Parliamentary Assembly, the Court of Justice, and the Council of Ministers are shared by all 3 communities. These organizations have some of the aspects of sovereignty from the fact that their decisions do not have to be unanimous, are binding on states and on citizens who have not agreed to them, and can be financed by funds that may be levied without current consent of persons being taxed. When do people ever give consent to being taxed? That's why it's a tax. If it would just be charity if they were giving their consent. On the whole, the supranational aspects of these institutions will be strengthened in the future from provisions in the treaties themselves. All this is very relevant to the remarks in the last chapters on the disintegration of the modern, unified sovereign state and the redistribution of its powers to multi-level hierarchical structures remotely resembling the structure of the Holy Roman Empire in the late medieval period. The impact of these tentative steps towards an integrative Europe has been spectacular, especially in the economic sphere. In general, the economic expansion of Western Europe, especially its industrial expansion, has been at rates far higher than those of communist dominated Eastern Europe, with the EEC rates higher than those of non EEC Western European countries, and considerably higher than those of either Britain or the United States. By the 1960s, the 300 million people of Western Europe had per capita incomes over a third higher than the 260 million persons in the same area had in 1938 to 1939. Industrial production more than doubled over the same time span, while agricultural production was a third larger with a smaller working force. This optimistic picture was even brighter for the 6 of the EEC, whose general economic growth was considerably over 6% a year during the 1950s. This was more than double the rate of growth in the United States, which was not much different from that in Britain. If these rates are maintained, it has been estimated that the income per head in the EEC would increase from about a third of the income per head in the United States in 1960 to more than half the United States income per head in 1970. The reason for this relative boom in the EEC and in Western Europe generally, in comparison with the slower economic dynamics of the English-speaking countries, are of some importance. It does not seem to rest, as it might appear at first glance, on a contrast between directed planning and laissez-faire, because within the EEC, the French economy is fairly rigorously planned and the West German economy is surprisingly free, yet both have had high rates of growth. The West German condition, however, have been misleading and have arisen largely from artificially low wage levels and thus low cost of production, especially on articles for export into the international competitive market, such as Volkswagens. These low labor costs arose from the large number of East European refugees seeking work in Germany, a coalition a condition that will be of decreasing importance in the future. The conditions of economic growth in the EEC has been based on steady demand, high rates of investment, and liberal fiscal and financial policies. In 1961, for example, the rate of net investment in Britain was about 9% compared to the West German rate of about 17%. The high demand that spurred on this process arose from fiscal policies, but also from the large new markets of about 100 million persons provided in the EEC. In Britain and in the United States with Canada, fiscal policies were much more conservative, with demand somewhat dampered down by efforts to balance budgets, to control inflation, and to influence both adverse balances of international payments and the flows of domestic credit by conservative financial policies, notably high interest rates. Moreover, in both countries, there was a good deal of unproductive expenditure either in misjudged enterprises and inefficient production or in defense or other non productive areas. As a consequence, not only have growth rates been low in the English speaking countries, but employment rates have been high. In 1960, for example, the United States unemployment rate was 5.4% and the Canadian 6.9%, while that of France was 1.3% and of West Germany was only 0.9%. This sharp contrast between the prosperity of the EEC and the languishing economy of Britain eventually brought the latter to recognition of the advantages of membership in the European system. But the decision was too late, based on wrong motives, and was eventually nullified by the imperious de Gaulle, who, like an elephant, never forgets an injury. Governments in London paid lip service to European unity and to British cooperation with it, but whenever an opportunity offered to take a real step towards a European Union, Britain balked. In the same immediate post-war period, this reluctance was attributed to the rather provincial and doctrinaire socialist outlook of the British Labour Party, but the situation did not improve when Winston Churchill returned to office in 1951. The general British outlook was that British participation in a united Europe was precluded by Britain's rather intangible and sentimental commitments to the Commonwealth and to the United States, that is, to the English speaking idea, and that a unification of Europe without Britain would be a threat to British markets on the continent. This decision by Britain was copied by the Scandinavian and Baltic countries, Denmark and Finland, whose trade alliance with England went back to the creation of the Sterling Bloc in 1932. In a similar way, Britain refused to cooperate in the ECSC or the EDC. This reluctance in London was a great tragedy, excluding Britain from the European growth towards economic prosperity, making it difficult or impossible for the European effort towards integration to make decisions that would have hastened the whole integrative process, and leaving Britain emphasizing Commonwealth and American relations that were less and less prepared to give due weight to British ideas and power. In a sense, Britain was making commitments to areas that were not prepared to make reciprocal commitments to Britain and would, if the occasion arose, leave Britain out on a limb. This, indeed, is exactly what happened in October 1956, when the United States threatened to throw its power and prestige against Britain's efforts in the Suez fiasco. And throughout the period, the chief Commonwealth countries, notably South Africa and Canada, made it perfectly clear that they were not willing to make any notable sacrifices for Britain's prosperity and were reluctant to follow London's lead in many of the world's political issues of the period. In fact, Even with Commonwealth preference and all the intangibles that link the Commonwealth together, Britain's trade and financial links with the Commonwealth are decreasing in importance, and the links of both with outsiders are increasing. For example, Nigeria and Ghana doubled their exports to EEC over the 1955 to 1959 period, while their exports to Britain decreased by 15%. On the whole, in recent years, the countries associated with the sterling area have found that association one of decreasing satisfaction. This is reflected in matters other than market conditions. Sterling itself has been subject to periodic crises since the war ended. The reason is obvious, for the United Kingdom tries to handle $12.3 billion in imports and $10.9 billion in floating short-term debts on a base of reserves of no more than $3 billion in 1961, while at the same time the EEC with $16 billion in reserves had only $2 billion in short-term debts and handled $23.2 billion in imports. As a result of all this, London is decreasingly attractive as a source of investment capital, while the EEC becomes increasingly prominent in that activity. And as a source of development funds for backwards areas, the United Kingdom has ceased to be of major significance. In 1960, for example, the United States provided $3,781 million, and the EEC provided $2,626 million compared to the United Kingdom's $857 million and the rest of the OECD countries' $469 million. In fact, Germany's $616 million was almost comparable to Britain's $857 million, with both far less than France's $1,287 million. Thus, the six provide about a third of the world's financial assistance to underdeveloped countries, while Britain provides only 1/9. Considerations such as these help to indicate that the Commonwealth attachment to the United Kingdom is based rather on the intangibles of traditions of and old patterns than on the solid advantages of today's economic and financial situation. The merging of the United Kingdom into the EEC would still give a fair jolt to economic life both in England and in the Commonwealth, but the slack would be taken up very rapidly. In fact, the rising demand for goods of higher quality in Japan will probably draw much of the export trade of New Zealand and Australia in butter, meat, or even wool from their older English speaking markets, even without Britain joining the common market. The reluctance of the English leadership to face these challenging conditions, like their refusal to face the causes of Britain's economic lassitude, contributed much to confuse the situation that Europe and especially EEC reached by the mid 1960s. In December 1956, in a vain effort to sidetrack European integration, British Foreign Secretary Selwyn Lloyd produced a grand design, a pompous name for an undigested scheme to dump an assortment of European consultative bodies into the common assembly of the coal and steel community. This idea was generally recognized as sabotage and sank without a ripple. The next British effort was for a free trade area. This was a scheme to permit British goods to enter the common market without Britain joining it. This was necessary in British eyes because the joint external tariff of the ECC was to be higher than the tariffs of the four of the six had previously been and would reduce British sales in those countries. The Free Trade Area Plan was for an all Europe free trade zone embracing the six, along with all those who did not wish to join the EEC. That means that the free trade area would abolish mutual trade barriers, but would not establish a common external tariff. This British suggestion, made in November 1956, was regarded within the EEC as another effort at sabotage, or at best, a typical British attempt to have the advantages of both worlds by combining the abolition of European tariffs on British goods with continued British preference for Commonwealth foodstuffs. The lower prices on the latter, compared to the food prices within the six, would permit Britain to have lower wage costs and thus lower industrial prices to give British industry a competitive advantage in the unprotected common market. When France, with West German support, broke off the free trade area negotiations in December 1958, the British were left out of the EEC, which began to function in the ruins of the free trade area. Britain reacted by forming the European Free Trade Association, EFTA, of Britain, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Austria, Switzerland, Portugal, and later Finland. This EFTA provided for mutual tariff reductions of member states by steps to complete abolition by 1970, but the process added only 38 million persons to the existing British market of 52 million and promised small prospect of any substantial increase in sales because the tariffs of most of these countries were already low on British goods. This could not compare with the EEC market of 170 million customers, but British public opinion, even in the 1960s, could not bring itself to accept the reorientation of outlook required to view itself as a European state, necessary to make it possible to accept the economic integration that could make this great market available to British industry. For this, the semi-slump of 1960 to 1961 was needed, and only in July 1961 did the British government announce its readiness to start the complex negotiations needed for its joining the common market. By that late date, de Gaulle was well established in power in France and was prepared to impose his own peculiar point of view on the negotiations. The French economic resurgence, which the British so badly, which the British so belatedly asked to join, was in no sense a consequence of de Gaulle's policies, nor were they synchronized except accidentally with the advent of de Gaulle and his Fifth French Republic on May 13, 1958. The basis for the French economic boom was laid under the Fourth French Republic, and de Gaulle simply profited from it. It might be said that the economic expansion and its continuation after 1958 was based on those factors of the French system which the new de Gaulle regime left relatively unchanged: an educational structure accessible to anyone willing to work hard at his studies, the high quality of upper level technical education, the close alliance between the administrative bureaucracy and the industrial system, and the ease with which highly educated technicians can pass from one to the other, by the readiness of the French mind to accept a rational, overall view of life and its problems. This contributed considerably to the success of French economic planning, and by the whole concept of individual opportunity and careers open to talent within a structured social arrangement. All these go back to the Napoleonic period of French history and were thus well adapted to de Gaulle's personal inclinations. The fact that they were all quite alien to the English way of life also helps to explain the relative failure of the British economy in the planned era. The Fifth Republic was obviously tailored to de Gaulle's personal inclinations, but it was also adapted to the bureaucratic substructure that continued as a semi-alien basis to underlie the French political system in the bourgeois era. Worded in another way, we might say that the shift of the Western world over the last 3 decades from a bourgeois to a technocratic pattern was well adapted to the subterranean bureaucratic basis that had survived in France, more or less unobserved during the century in which property was obviously triumphant. The bureaucracy of Louis XIV and Napoleon had built up had been directed towards totalitarian power and national glory. The age of property, roughly 1836 to 1936, had sought to establish the influence of wealth unhampered by bureaucracy, and one of its chief aims had been to keep the bureaucratic structure, the centralized French tradition of administration, and the forces of French rationalism outside the sphere of economics and money making. The economic depression of the 1930s and the defeat of the 1940s, both directly caused by the selfish interest and narrow outlook, especially the narrow and selfish financial outlook of the French bourgeois, made it clear that some new system was needed in France, just as the experience of the resistance made it clear that some new system was needed in Europe. It was, in view of the French rationalist and bureaucratic tradition, almost inevitable that the new domestic system would be more integrated, more rational, and more bureaucratic than that of the bourgeois era, although it is not so clear what this new system will establish as its goal. This, indeed, is the problem facing France today, a problem concerned with goals rather than with methods, since there is now a broad consensus, including the bourgeois, prepared to accept a rationalized, planned, bureaucratized society dominated by a pervasive fiscalism, a kind of neo-mercantilism, but there is no consensus on what goals this new organization should seek. All right, I'm just going to stop reading there. Okay, got like 20 pages left in the book. You can see that stuff is just basically like the precursor to the European Union. Basically, that it was pretty much inevitable because everybody's afraid of Germany. Europe's afraid of Germany. The rest of Europe's afraid of Germany. America's afraid of Germany, and the Soviet Union is afraid of Germany because Germany can upset the balance of power basically between any of these countries by either attacking Europe in cooperation with Russia or attacking Russia in cooperation with Europe. And once that happens, then if Europe or Russia gets destabilized, then the United States is under threat of being attacked. So everybody was just interested in controlling Germany for the fact that, for those facts. So you can see how they brought them all into the European Union, and you can see that Britain's characteristics hasn't really changed much. They like can't figure out if they want to be in the European Union or if they want to be part of like the Anglosphere. So a lot of the stuff you can see how it panned out. Obviously now we have the European Union and they're pretty much equal. Their economy's like equal with the dollar, and their England is half in, half out of the European Union. So it kind of pretty much went along the same lines as projected here. So not too much deep conspiracy there. At least he's not getting into it. So that's the video for today. Thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this part anyway. So have a good day and peace.